Obviously, the topic of representation is taking us to a lot of different areas. We're considering a lot of different aspects that are relevant to human cognition, and representation has been a hotly discussed topic, often poorly discussed because the various issues that are at stake are often not teased out. If we're speaking of the representation of knowledge, and we're trying to understand human cognition, that seems to make most sense within a computational view of mind and brain. And there are other competitors as well. There's a lot of room for disagreement here, and it can come to be trivialized as a debate between those who believe in representations and those who don't believe in representations. And I don't think that's a very good way of looking at it. Rather, the manner in which you lean on a specific kind of representation will make clear what your commitments are with respect to nervous systems, brains, and the world. So the computational theory of mind tends to be extremely neurocentric. It assumes that the synapses and spikes in the brain represent or are human cognition, are equivalent to mind, and that representation must be going on there. One reason to be cautious about that is to note that if you attribute everything to the brain, you've attributed very little to the world, and yet an awful lot of what we know, even a lot of what we remember or what we understand, can only be known or remembered or understood in specific world contexts. So memory is a huge topic that we cannot do justice to at all in this module, unfortunately, because it means too many different things. But it's a good example of the conundrums, the questions that we face. If we attribute everything to brains, if we think brains store memories, we must recognize that the act of remembering is nearly always done in a specific context. And actually, an awful lot of that remembering is only possible if the world plays along. So I rely enormously now on my computer, for example, to remember things. And for the last 5,000 years, some people have relied on writing to remember things. And there are other ways to shape the landscape and the environment to support memory. And so we could ask, is memory independent of the world? Is memory the kind of thing that you can stick into the head? And here we come back where we started in this module with Descartes' problem. Descartes introduced this tragic separation between mind and world, meaning that he sort of was committed to a dualism in which knowledge of the world is separate from being in the world. And a caricature of the position that ensues leads to this problem. If my senses take in information about a world and then they build a representation of the world, for whom is that a representation? It's sort of if you think of representations as pictures and sentences, they still seem to need someone to interpret them. So pictures and sentences don't interpret themselves. So we just seem to have regressed the problem down, as in the image here, where you get little men in the head making sense of the representations. This is called a homuncular fallacy. There's an absolutely brilliant exaggeration of this problem in the film Being John Malkovich. And I'm not sure YouTube will let me do this, but I'm just going to play you the trailer for this fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. The plot centers around precisely what we're talking about. If you take Descartes' position to extremes, then you are located inside your head. And in this movie, some other people get inside someone's head. There's a portal to getting inside John Malkovich's head. I know it makes no sense. Don't worry about that. It's great fun. But then the people find themselves inside the head, looking out through the eyes, as if the eyes were windows. And then what follows is actually remarkably profound, because in the movie there's a great deal of concern over who owns the body, and Malkovich fights with the ghosts in his head for control of the body. A completely surreal part of this story, as if this wasn't surreal enough, is that after a few minutes inside his head, I think 15 minutes, you end up falling from the sky onto a New Jersey turnpike. That makes no sense. Let's just have a look at the trailer.
There's a tiny door in my office, Maxine, and it takes you inside John Malkovich.
There's no such thing as a hole in somebody's brain.
Yes, there is. You see the world through John Malkovich's eyes?
Yes.
And then after about 15 minutes,
That's not me. I didn't say that.
you're spit out into a ditch on the side of the New Jersey Turnpike.
It was amazing.
Where the hell are we? Where Malkovich is subconscious.
Do you think that it's kind of weird that John Malkovich has a portal? I mean, do you think that it might have some sort of significance?
What is going on? Huh?
I discovered that portal.
It's my head!
John Cusack, Cameron Diaz, Catherine Keener, and John Malkovich.
Malkovich! Malkovich!
Being John Malkovich.
I strongly recommend the movie. So this movie nicely illustrates the problem of infinite regress if we lean too heavily on a poorly thought out notion of representation. Of course, if those people are inside his head, then there must be people inside their heads looking at and so on. Another source of information about the way to think about brains, bodies, and knowledge has come from robotics. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was assumed that if we're going to build robots, they're going to have smart computer brains, and those brains are going to do all the figuring stuff out, so they're going to need complex representational systems. Rodney Brooks was one of these early roboticists, and his observations are interesting. He says, when I started building walking robots, I built six-legged robots rather than have them compute ahead of time a stable way of walking. I made the legs very sensitive to things that they touched in the environment. I made it so it was safe for the robot to fall down and had it learn how to scramble over rough terrain, feeling its way as it went, instead of sitting back looking at the whole terrain in front and computing an optimal path through. My robots got down and dirty with the environment and interacted with the environment at every step. What he found was that the manner in which the computational turn encouraged people to think about what the brain-body-world relationships were proved to be unhelpful in robotics. And he didn't need to represent the world to the robot, but rather to worry about the embedding of the robot in the world to make sure that the capacities of the robot matched the sort of terrain that it was required to work in. Similar observations have been quite commonplace in robotics ever since, and so our theme of representation has brought us once more to recognize poles in contemporary cognitive science, which emphasize different aspects of our being, and we've met this before, but they also rely on different notions of representation. Strongly representationalist approaches are quite commonplace in the computational theory of mind, and they emphasize a very intellectual, disembodied form of intelligence, if you will, whereas embodied and embedded cognitive accounts emphasize instead the reciprocal relationship between an organism and its world. And Rodney Brooks's observation is that he didn't need to represent the world because the world was there. It's its own best representation. It is quite clever. Movies are a good way to explore this, and one of the extremes to which one can take representational stories was turned into a thought experiment by a philosopher called Hilary Putnam, and it became known as the brain in a vat thought experiment. A thought experiment is just, let's play with reality and see if we can think our way to something interesting. We'll allow some aspects that are not relevant to the question we're considering to vary quite wildly, but we'll keep some aspects central that can inform our intuition. So a thought experiment Albert Einstein came up with was to think of what it would be like to ride on a missile approaching the speed of light. He didn't get funding to send anyone on a missile to approach the speed of light, but rather his questions were relating to the passage of time and the notion of space, and the practical dangers didn't bother him. Well, the brain in a vat was beautifully illustrated by the first Matrix movie, and if you haven't seen the first one, it's so much better than Matrix movies 2 and 3. It's shown in the bottom right there. In a future, dystopian future, the humans are being farmed by, the robots have got out of control. The machines are running the world. And they're farming humans for some unspecified kind of bioenergy, which doesn't make any sense. That's all right. And in order to keep these humans healthy, or so they produce their bioenergy, they're jacked into computers with an electrode going into the base of their skull. And the humans are entirely deceived about their present situation. They think they're out walking around in the year 1999. But guess what? It's all a computer simulation. That is so close to Hilary Putnam's brain in a vat idea. The brain in a vat expressed as so that if we regard conscious experience as arising solely from the activity of the brain on the basis of sensory input, then if we provided the brain with the right inputs, we'd have to monitor its motor outputs as well to make sure that the inputs change. If we provide the right inputs and outputs, then you could be a brain in a mad scientist's lair in a vat, receiving computer inputs, and you could be totally deluded about where you are. I'm not trying to convince you that that's what's actually happening, of course. Now, what these bring out is the logical difficulties that any account of the brain producing conscious experience must generate, must confront. I don't want you to take away from this that, oh cool, the brain in a vat it could all be a simulation. That's not the point. It's not there to say, gosh, it could all be a simulation. I want you to see what's necessary in order to get to that point where you can go, oh, maybe it's a simulation. The brain has to be treated as an input-output device. There's nothing in the brain that tells us it is an input-output device, and there are strong reasons to think it's not an input-output device, but the brain, in order to make this thought experiment coherent, the brain must be considered as an input-output device. Furthermore, conscious experience is attributed to the brain, not to the rest of the body. Pay attention to your legs, pay attention to your hands. Where is that feeling? Is it in your brain or is it in your hands? I'm just asking. It assumes that these electrical signals generate experience, and it assumes, the separability of perception and action underlies this view of the brain as an input-output device. So it's the assumptions I want you to pay attention to. These assumptions are necessary in order to make this thought experiment even comprehensible. And each of them is entirely optional. These are not views that are forced on us. So the point of this is not to say, wow, it could all be a simulation. The point of this is to say, what the hell are you thinking about brains if you're thinking that way? I'm sure we've got more movie recommendations to come.